All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am back with another Out of the Park Baseball 19 tutorial, and today I am talking about scouting. Some of the questions I'm trying to answer today are: what are the roles of scouts? How do I go about acquiring a good scout and knowing that I have a good scout? Um, and yeah, what's the difference between a scout and Out of the Park Scouting Association, shortened to be OSA? So, what's important about scouts is that they are how you interpret the game. It's really, think of it as sort of the looking glass into your out of the park universe, and the scout is sort of your interpreter that's communicating back information to you. This is definitely true, at least from a rating standpoint. So one thing I'd keep in mind right now as I click on one of my players, this is my second baseman, Josh Beasley. His contact rating is 45. But I don't know if that's actually 100% true, okay? Unless I cheat and use the editor, to look at his exact player ratings, there's no way I can know for sure that his contact's not actually a 50 on the 20 to 80 scale or a 40 on the 20 to 80 scale. Instead, what I'm viewing, as you can see as I go up to the top right here where my mouse is, I'm viewing the opinion of my head scout. So the head scout is essentially who's communicating to me this information. So I can't know for sure if that's actually 100% true, but he's just giving me the best approximation he can, and it's very important for me, for the most part, to trust him. And if that's why you need to have a good head scout, because your head scout is who's going to be providing the information to you for all your players, all the players in your organization, as well as players in all other organizations. So that's very important for doing things like making trades or signing the right free agents. You need to have a good scout who's going to communicate to you the most accurate information possible. If I look at the opinions of OSA says, hey, we have a disagreement. For example, OSA thinks that Josh Beasley's scout power is a 65 on the 20 to 80 scale. My ad scout thinks it's a 55. As a general rule, I'm going to default to what my scout thinks because OSA is just a very sort of loose approximation that's available for everybody. And you're going to want to find a scout that you can trust more than OSA. And by default, you're generally going to side with your scout. I use the 20 to 80 scale, as I've sort of previously just shown. If you want to change your scale, you can go to Game and Game Settings. Right now you can see my scouting accuracy is normal. If you want things a little bit easier on yourself, you could go to High or Very High, and your scout would, as a general rule, be a little more all-knowing, a little more omnipotent. Some people will use Low or even Very Low. But I like to use Normal. I think Normal is okay. As you can see, my player rating scale and potential rating scale and other rating scale, 20 to 80. Now, the reason I use 20 to 80 is because that is what scouts use in real life. They use 20 to 80 with increments of 5, so you won't see anyone rated like 53, for contact. They'll be 50 or 55. Other options, 1 to 5, 2 to 8. I see people use 1 to 5. Sometimes it adds another hint of mystery to the ratings, at least, because that's sort of less increments. How can you determine a player with 3 contact versus a player with 4 contact? That's tough. That's a pretty big gap, and there's a lot of mystery there. 2 to 8, I don't really see people use. 1 to 10 and 1 to 20, I see people use a good bit. 1 to 20, I imagine would be a pretty common choice for people who play Football Manager. Football Manager is a soccer simulation game similar to Out of the Park Baseball, and I think they use a 1 to 20 system, or at least have a 1 to 20 system that many people use. As I said before, I use 20 to 80, and you can also use 1 to 100. I think that would maybe be an interesting one if you're, say, an MLB The Show player, and players are rated on that 1 to 100 scale. But one thing I will say is that these ratings are very much done on a bell curve of sorts. So if you have a player who's 50 on the 1 to 100 scale or something, that means they're average. But if you have a guy who's like 50 overall in MLB The Show, that means he's crap and should never be in the major leagues. Whereas 50 in this game would be, just MLB average. So definitely keep in mind that all these ratings, both individual and as a whole, are on a bell curve. So a guy with guys with 50 contact or 55 contact or 45 contact at the major league level, pretty common. Guys with 70 contact, really uncommon, and there might be one or two guys with 80 contact as a whole. An interesting setting I've always found right here is show ratings greater than max. So there's guys who, if you think about two players who points in their careers might have been rated as having like 80 contact, there's one is still going to be better than the other. You know what I mean? So when you have guys who have sort of this one generational tool, like let's say Ichiro's ability to make contact in his prime, or maybe Byron Buxton's sprint speed right now, you can actually give your scouts the option to go beyond that. So you might say, oh, you know what, on a 20/80 scale, he's like 85 at this. He's that good. I prefer to leave it cut off. I find that more realistic. If some guy's absolutely insane at something, they're just going to say 80, and that's what a scout would do in real life. All right, now that we've at least had a look at the scouting settings, I'm going to sort of show you guys how one would go about acquiring a good scout, and also my scout as well in this save. This is my Marlins save, so if you want to view your scouts, one thing you can do is you can go to your front office and you can go to scouting. And here is my scout. His name is Travis Jones. He has 4 years of experience and his reputation is great. Now, one thing that's important to know for all personnel is that reputation doesn't necessarily equal how good they are at their job. It just sort of is an amalgamation of what sort of successes or failures they've experienced, what positions they've held, as well as it's just how many years they've been around. So perhaps more important are his scouting ratings. As you can see, he's outstanding, excellent, legendary, outstanding. And I believe the reason I hired him in particular was because he was legendary in international scouting. So that's very helpful for things like international amateurs, as well as when they go on their little scouting trips. You've probably noticed this before, but scouts go on scouting trips and they sort of pick up players along the way. You might get emails in the middle of the season or in the off-season that says, hey, I went to Venezuela and I found this player. And usually they're not going to be very good. They're usually going to be a 0.5 star potential, but every now and then he might find someone who could be of major league quality. So as you can see right here, this is where the screen where you would set your scouting budget, as well as how that budget is to be distributed. I am not in the off-season right now. I'm in spring training, basically. The off-season runs from November to February, or I think to early February, and that's when you can adjust these numbers. But as you can see, I have his scouting budget cranked up to $6 million, which is the maximum. If you have the money to do it, definitely try to get his scouting budget as high as possible, because that will allow him to acquire valuable information. Here is how I have the budget distributed. As a default, it's probably going to be something like 25, 25, 25, 25. You can leave Major League Scouting at 5, and it's absolutely fine, because there's much less sort of variance between how Major League players are scouted, so I can show you guys something like that in the future. But focus on your minor league scouting. This will help you assess players both within your minor league system as well as in other people's minor league systems, which is important for if you're trading for a prospect. Amateur scouting helps with the draft, and international scouting, as I said, will help with those trips that he makes, as well as when you sign international amateurs in July. So I was just going to show you a few player examples of how sort of scouts versus OSA, the Out of the Park Scouting Association, have evaluated them. So I think one player I was going to show you was, yes. Okay, so this guy's a prospect for me right now. He's on the spring training roster, but he's not going to sniff the big leagues this year, it looks like. But if we look at scouting, we can see his current assessments right now, but we can also sort of see his past reports from Miami Marlins head scouts, as well as past reports by OSA, the Out of the Park Scouting Association. So one thing that stood out to me is if we look at the initial report from Out of the Park Scouting Association, the earliest one we have is from January 2025. They have his contact potential at 30, his power potential at 35, and his eye potential at 55. But my scout with the Miami Marlins thought that his contact potential was 55, his power was 45, at least in terms of potential, and his eye was 65. So this is a really big gap. And that's sort of something I want to get across to all of you, is that if you look at a major league player, the gaps between their stats, the stats of how your scout interprets them and how OSA interprets them, aren't going to be that big. That's part of the reason why it doesn't really matter that you can get away with, just putting 5% of your budget into major league scouting. because Major League players as a whole are just more known quantities than trying to project 18-year-olds, for example. So, but yeah, so a really big difference between how these players have been evaluated at that point, and even as he progresses further now, you can still see a big difference. For instance, my scout believes that his eye is much better than that of what OSA predicts. So definitely stay aware of what your head scout thinks on these players, because if you were to just default to OSA, decent chance you could miss out on a good player. Now we're going to take a look at Ernesto, my boy. He is probably the best player in the league right now, best player on my team. Maybe he might be the best player I've had in the save, to be honest with you. He's pretty fantastic, as you can just see from the stats. But as I switch between these ratings between Head Scout and OSA, you can see not too much variance there. Some miniature stuff within the ratings, but the big picture is that he's still this amazing player. So that's kind of the reason why you can get away with the 5%. I was going to show you guys how this could matter for if you're making a trade. So I'm just going to go to a trade screen. And then, so say if I were to trade for a New York Yankees prospect. I'm just trying to see if there's anyone. Okay, here's an interesting guy. Okay, yeah, this guy stood out to me. So here's what my head scout thinks of Ian Edwards. He thinks, okay, 60 home run power, so a legit power threat. But when you look at his contact, 35, 40 I, and 45 avoid Ks. This is a guy who is just not going to be able to touch the ball enough to do anything with that 60 home run power. This doesn't, for a first baseman, this says, probably a career minor leaguer. But if I look at OSA, they're projecting 60 contact and 80 home run power, as well as average avoid Ks. This is a guy, if he were to develop to fully to these stats, would be one of the premier power hitters in the league. So big difference here. And if you think of out of the park baseball as an information battle, having a good scout is important for acquiring the best information possible. Now, I'm not saying that my head scout's right here. I'm not saying that my head scout thinks that this, just because my head scout thinks this guy is as good as OSA thinks, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's right 100% of the time. But overall, if you go through and you make 10 trades and you listen to your scout, you draft 10 players and you listen to your scout, you're having access to the most accurate information possible. It can only be done through having a good scout whose budget is also done well and distributed well. So that's why it's important to have a good scout. All right, hopefully that was useful. A lot of people will say that OSA is completely useless. I disagree. I think it's at least decent as a second opinion. One thing that's important is if I were to trade for that guy, the Yankees organization wouldn't necessarily go off what OSA thinks. It would go off what their own scout thinks. So, but at the very least, now you understand how scouts are important for assessing your out of the park universe. Last thing I will show you all is how one would go about acquiring a good scout. Maybe you start off your save and you're not too happy with your scout's ratings. What you can do is you can go to MLB, Transactions, Personnel, and I can switch to Preferred Occupation Scout, and I have it set to view their scout ratings. So what I would do is I would maybe sort by Scout International. As you can see, a lot of these guys are excellent. One thing I'll talk about is in terms of their preference. You'll see favorability, favor tools, and the neutral. My scout is favorability. A lot of people will actually recommend to use favor tools or even highly favor tools. The reason for that being is that favorability is sort of based maybe more on what their statistical output is, and versus favor tools might just be things like how fast they are or how good they are with the glove, or how good their power is. So a lot of people will say, I can assess stats myself. Give me a guy who can at least assess the skills they have. The scout I have right now is favorability, but that's because I just really liked his whole array of ratings in terms of scouting international and scouting amateur. So as you can see right here, if I were looking to hire a scout today, I think one that would sort of stand out to any of these guys would be decent enough because they've got excellent Scout International, and I look at Scout International and Scout Amateurs as being key. But I quite like this guy. That is an unfortunate last name, but yeah, Kip over here is. I like that he's outstanding Scout Amateurs and excellent Scout International. This guy is excellent at everything. He has favorability, so chances are, if you don't have a great scout when you boot up your save, you can find one and hire him. So yeah, if I wanted to do that, I could just go to actions and offer contract. And if I were to offer this contract and they would accept, my other scout would be automatically fired. So yep, that's all I have to say about scouting and the role of scouts. Hopefully this was useful. It felt a little bit rambly, but I tried to sort of write down an outline of the topics I wanted to cover. So yeah, once again, all feedback in the comments is appreciated. Also on Reddit. So yeah, until next time, I am signing off.